Evening, everyone. We're on the penultimate evening. There is a gap next week. We'll remind ourselves of that at the end again. They have other activities through Drumalis on the fourth Tuesday of each month. So we skip next week and come back for the final evening on the 29th of March. But I'll remind everyone again at the end about that. But we look this evening at living with Imperial Legacies. Empires, as I think we recognize, they come, they go. They all leave a mark on history. Not all bad. We should say that there are positive things that have happened, but they do leave a mark on history. And part of the issue is that every empire likes to tell its own story. It's usually a good, positive narrative that empires tell about themselves. On the other hand, those who experience colonialism tell a rather different story. We've kept, on a number of occasions, using the expression, history is what hurts. And history from below is very different from history from above. And after empire falls, it very often silences history. It even locks away imperial documents. There are thousands locked away somewhere in England. And this is all about keeping imperial history under wraps. It would not be good for people to maybe hear and realize the real story. And it's also a way in which the history is kept away from the school and university curriculum in relation to imperial history. But we live at a time when silence is being broken and repressed history is more and more surfacing. And the former empires, in particular the European empires, are rather uncomfortable about it all and even sometimes outraged by it. Well, we began this study, you remember, way back 2334 BCE, with the very first empire, the Akkadian Empire, led by Sargon. And there has been a succession of empires ever since. And for the last 500 years, we have had European empires dominating the world. And you remember that the European powers met in Berlin from 1884 to 1885, hosted by the Chancellor Bismarck. And they had a great big map of Africa on the wall, which they color-coded for colonization by 7 European powers. And those 7 European colonial powers were Belgium, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Portugal. So they color-coded that map in Berlin, and then 1884, 1885, and in a very short time, by 1902, those powers occupied 95% of Africa. And Africa, of course, is still dominated by colonial legacies. China is now an increasing economic and cultural force in Africa. Empires are characterized by 3 Gs. I think we may have mentioned that before: gold, guns, and God. Now, I suppose oil has become a substitute for gold, or did become a substitute for gold. And now even non-fossil alternative resources are becoming a substitute for oil. Empires are built on extraction economies, the taking of rich resources from the colonized to enrich an elite. It never enriches the entire metropolis back home. It is always the enrichment of an elite that occurs with empires. And of course, the looting of priceless things is also a feature. We're beginning to face into that now also. The Netherlands has decided to return all its imperial loot, And in the last 2-3 weeks, Austria and earlier, Germany, France, and Belgium have set up commissions to examine and decide about their imperial loot. The University of Aberdeen is going through an audit of everything it has in archives and its resource to see what was gifted and what in fact was, if you like, stolen by empire, and they will have decisions to make in Aberdeen. The most famous things, I think, within the UK are probably the Elgin marbles from Greece and the invaluable Noor diamond worn on particular British royal occasions, usually such as the opening of Parliament. And it looks at the moment that the Elgin marbles and the Noor diamond are staying put in Britain and won't be going anywhere. Military activity and guns are an imperial constant. Empires conquer, and they sustain empire very often with military, and resistance, any resistance, is brutally crushed. And independence, when it comes, never seems to come without violence. Empires do not just walk away from their colonies. They may give an impression, and have given the impression, that they were there all the time so that the colonies would reach independence and receive it, and that was the plan. It's not very likely, because those who resist are usually labeled as rebels. They're blamed for the violence. But then the empire came with guns. Another feature is that every empire will instrumentalize God or the gods to legitimize and justify oppressive and economic domination. The mandate of heaven is how the Chinese speak of it. Zeus and Mars were the gods for the Romans, the Christian God for the Europeans, and Allah for the Ottoman Empire. And from the Akkadian Empire to the present day, every empire has produced what we can call its theology of empire, and it's a claim to ultimate power and to ultimate authority. In 2011, President Obama visited Britain, and in his key speech, he resorted to, let's say, triumphalism and Anglo-American exceptionalism. Quote, he said, "There are few nations that stand firmer, speak louder, and fight harder to defend democratic values around the world than the United States and the United Kingdom." He went on to affirm that the rest of the world needs to embrace the market-based principles that the United States and the United Kingdom have always embraced. In other words, Western capitalism. He then said more than perhaps he realized. Power, he said, rarely gives up without a fight, particularly in places where there are divisions of tribe and divisions of sect. What we are seeing in Tehran, in Tunis, in Tahrir Square is a longing for the same freedoms that we take for granted here at home. Now, the president didn't seem to be aware in that moment, or maybe want to acknowledge, that empires, all of them, operate and have operated a divide and rule strategy and have been responsible for the very divisions of tribe and sect that carry on long after the empire has crashed out, but never without a fight. The imperial narrative is that the empire withdrew from its colonies and granted its former colonies political and economic independence and a peaceful transfer of sovereignty. But decolonization was nearly always violent, bloody, and a major trauma and turmoil for the colonized. No empire has given up without a fight. France fought brutally in Vietnam, left humiliated, and then partitioned the country. And after horrendous violence and killing, France left Algeria in 1962. The British left Egypt after being humiliated in a war they foolishly started, and they left Kenya with the Mau Mau massacres. We might say they also left Ireland, or part of it, in 1922, after not a little killing and partition. In the Northeast, the majority Protestants were prepared to fight to remain in the empire. They did remain in the empire. The irony was that 30 years later, there was no empire for nationalists to leave, and no empire in which unionists could remain. It had gone. From 1939 to 1984, the French, the Dutch, and the British empires had all crashed out of Asia. From 1932 to 1975, the British, Italian, French, Belgium, Portuguese, and Spanish empires all crashed out of Africa. And that was less than 100 years after they had carved up Africa at the Berlin Conference. The European empires and powers were gone. The last countries to realize their independence were Angola from Portugal, Morocco from Spain, both in 1975. After World War II, the British had ideas about enlarging their empire. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Portugal, all wanted to develop their colonies. And after the war, they were all in the end game. And in 30 years after World War II, the European empires had all collapsed, and the Asian and African countries had got their independence, and the process of decolonization was often violent but rapid. In 1960, the United Nations passed a resolution which denounced colonialism as a serious abuse of human rights and declared that self-determination was legally binding. And the United Nations had grown from 51 states in 1945 to 193 today. And most of the new states came into existence as a result of the collapse of imperial powers. We have actually lived through an historic shift of colonial powers to a world of nation states. The European empires have all gone. Empires always come to an end, and they never last. It's a constant of history. But then it seems also that new empires emerged. We have lived through the Cold War, the big powers of the US and the USSR. We thought that had ended. Now we know it hasn't. And Ukraine finds itself the meat, if you like, in the sandwich in what has become a bloody and brutal hot war. And then there has been a new Cold War between the US and China, with the US expecting Europe to help contain the Chinese while Europe and China develop stronger trading links. And even this little island has been caught up in the last number of weeks with would-be Imperial Russia, with an ambassador in Dublin, inexplicably, maybe not, something of a disgrace, and an Irish ambassador being summoned to the offices in Moscow. So imperial legacies are all around us. They don't go away. We are part of them in different ways. and we still feel their influence and their impact in a number of different ways. Maybe we go to groups at this stage. Loretta will put us into rooms. There are a couple of questions we might discuss. Our modern history is imperial or colonial history. Well, how do we read history? Whose history do we read? And why is empire always resisted, and why so much violence in the end? Well, see where conversations go over the next 20 minutes, and then we'll come back and have a conversation. There we go. Let's go to the second part and continue to look at living with legacies. As we now are aware, the European empires all came to an end, as all empires do. The flags were lowered, and rather than empires leave their colonized territories, it might be as accurate to say that the colonized actually came out of empire. But decolonization was a tumultuous process, and the imperial influence has never quite left. The process continues, and neo-colonialism returns and takes various shapes and forms. Some empires were long-lasting. Portugal, for example, occupied Macau from 1550 to 1990. The Dutch were in the East Indies for 3 centuries. France was in Algeria for 132 years. And the British Raj were in India 1858 to 1947. And of course, the East India Company had been in India for 2 centuries before the big mutiny, as the empire described it, of 1857. Germany was in Africa for only 30 years, and France and Britain administered mandates in the Middle East for a similar period of time. The Ottomans, on the other hand, dominated for 600 years. There's been a huge assumption, I suppose, in Europe that we ruled the world for much of human history. Well, that assumption is also a racial construct in that whites ruled the world. But European imperial dominance was a mere blip in the larger span of history. But the legacy of empire is part of our everyday lives. In Ireland and in the UK, we enjoy curry. The French enjoy couscous, profitable trades of empire. And if in the last 10 minutes you had coffee or tea, well, where did the tea and the coffee and the spices all come from? The tomatoes, the maize, the chocolate. And where would we be without sugar that came from the slave plantations? And where would cities like Liverpool and Glasgow be without sugar, without cotton? We might even ask, is a European menu possible without colonial foodstuffs, which we sometimes drink and eat from our Chinese porcelain? Our botanical gardens are full of colonial flora and zoos with animals from the colonies. The human migrants and refugees are here because we were there. And racism and hate crimes and white exceptionalism are imperial legacies. In Northern Ireland now, racist hate crimes have overtaken sectarian hate crimes. The last French team to win the Soccer World Cup had more North African players than white French. They were from former French colonies. Captain Zinedine Zidane was Algerian born. And the sporting triumphalism after gold medals won by Mo Farah at the London Olympics in 2012 tended to overlook that he was actually from Africa and a former British colony. And Pelé, the greatest Brazilian soccer player ever, perhaps the greatest soccer player in the world ever, called the Black Diamond, but forgotten that he is black Brazilian because of slavery, not abolished in Brazil until 1888. Colonialism has been and continues to be bad for Africa. 4 phases of African colonial and economic slavery have been identified. 1, the slave trade, where 11 million Africans were enslaved and shipped out of Africa, and the slavery drained Africa of its labour force needed for its own economic development. 2, the harsh exploitation of African slave labour in the American plantations. And labour was the basis for Euro modernity, expansionism, and the wealth of the European empires. And 3, the scramble for Africa, worked out at that Berlin conference in 1884-1885, involving Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, and they all plundered Africa. And 4, yet again, Africa is in slavery. Now it is debt slavery. Neo-colonialism takes the form of the Global Financial Republic, as it's been called, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, World Trade Organization, and loans to African nations come with very strict conditions and a payback system, creating a lot of debt slavery. China is now involved and viewed as an alternative to the Global Financial Republic. Chinese money in Africa with no structural adjustment, but payment in form of mining rights. Chinese assistance going to mineral-rich countries such as Congo, Angola, and Zambia, stripping the natural resources of these countries. Now, China has not invaded or conquered as the French and the British did, but does seem to be following a Western colonial logic to build its wealth and therefore an empire. And we begin to ask, will Africa ever be free? The Welsh government announced in March 2021, a year ago, that Black history will be mandatory in schools in Wales. Welsh children will learn of the Black and Asian contribution to Wales, and this will also include a better understanding of imperialism and of a past. And that educational policy has been described by the Welsh as to enable ethical and informed citizens of Wales and the world. Well, citizenship today is both local and global, and it's important for us, I think, on the island of Ireland. Education at every level to be aware of the imperial past, that we are part of empire, living in the legacies of empire, not just British with all the ambivalence involved, but as Europeans, we are part of European imperialism and those empires that ruled the world, 95% of Africa at the beginning of the 20th century. So we do need critical awareness of imperial legacies. We do perhaps need to come out of an amnesia, maybe to come out of imperial nostalgia and realize where we've come from. And to paraphrase the words of the Welsh educational policy, we need to be ethical and informed citizens of Northern Ireland, Ireland, the world. Well, we may ask again a question if we want, why is it important for children and adults to know the history of empires and imperialism? Are the Welsh really onto something? What do you think?